The University Lectures Committee and the Committee on American Indian Programs are honored this evening to present Vine Deloria, Jr. He will speak to us on the subject, Dependent Domestic Nations. Vine Deloria was born in South Dakota on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. He is an enrolled member of the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe at Fort Yates, North Dakota. Vine Deloria attended Iowa State University, then Iowa State College of Agriculture and Mechanic Arts, and graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in 1958. His major was General Science, which I understand was a euphemism for an English major in those days. Subsequently, Deloria attended the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago and received a Master's of Theology degree in 1963. He then attended the University of Colorado Law School and was awarded a Doctor Juris degree in 1970. Vine Deloria has served and is presently serving on many boards and commissions. For example, the Council on Indian Affairs, the Institute for the Development of Indian Law, the Oglala Sioux Legal Rights Foundation, and the Colorado Centennial Bicentennial Commission. One of the first publications of Deloria's, which I read, was the resume of Custer Died for Your Sins, which appeared in the August 1969 edition of Playboy magazine. The article struck my eye because, among others, anthropologists got a real tongue lashing. But the article was provocative, as was the centerfold, so I assigned the Playboy issue as required reading to my anthropology classes. In addition to Custer Died for Your Sins, Vine Deloria has published many other valuable books and articles. Some of them are We Talk, You Listen, Of Utmost Good Faith, God is Red, Behind the Trail of Broken Treaties, and his most recent book, Indians of the Pacific Northwest. Vine Deloria has accomplished many other significant things which are reflected in his long and detailed vita. When I was asked to introduce Vine Deloria, I had planned to read the entire vita to you as part of my repentance for my anthropological sins. Instead, however, I've decided to take Vine Deloria at his word. So without further ado, he talk, we listen. Vine Deloria.
That article on anthropologists was right after the centerfold. And this is the first person I've ever met who's read it. Most of them got the centerfold and then stopped. I never ever thought I would be speaking at Iowa State to an audience. I went here for about 4 years, but I never much got past the coffee bar down there, and I think I probably put more time in the student union than anyone sitting in the audience. We used to go through 2 decks of pinochle cards a week when I went to school here. And I really don't think I've played pinochle more than once or twice since I left here. But it is a pleasure to come back and see the campus. And so many things have changed here. I had to have a guide in and out with all these big buildings. When there were less buildings, we used to have panty raids and all kinds of things. I see Don Benbow down there in the audience, who used to lead me astray as much as possible whenever he could get me. Does that work? Anymore, I get kind of nervous when a strange person comes up and fools the microphone. You don't know what government agency you're dealing with. So you kind of back off a little. But the campus really has changed. I don't know if I could find my way from class to class. I did, when I was very young, 1950, enroll at the University of Colorado. And I was there for 3 days. I could never find a class, and so I went back to the reservation. And it wasn't until I found Iowa State, which was much smaller at the time, that I could get from class to class and get from the student union back, that I actually started in on an education. I chose a rather serious topic tonight, knowing that as of yesterday, or as of today, the Field Foundation was releasing a report that I had done for them, a recommendation to the Peanut on what he can do the next 4 years to straighten out Indian affairs. I was going to put a little sex in the beginning of the book with the hope that he might lust after Indians, but I end up just a straightforward recommendation. So I didn't know what variety of forces might be trying to track me through Iowa as of this evening, so I thought I'd better have a fairly serious discussion topic. And so I chose dependent domestic nations, which is a phrase that comes out of Supreme Court case Worcester versus Georgia. And it seems to me to sum up very adequately the report released by Field Foundation today, and I think the key words of how Indian problems really can be resolved. And that is that I think the major message the Indian community has to make to the rest of American society is to pull them back to their history and remind them of what the changes of 400 years have meant. Today, when we try to deal with people in the federal bureaucracy or people at the state level, or even more important, people in the private area, foundations and academic institutions, there's a tendency in the non-Indian world to forget American history and the story of how America was settled. And what a great many Indians are dealing with today is the attempt to force white America to recognize not simply the treaties, but the long-standing existence of Indian tribes on this continent. The existence in not simply a political sense, but cultural, religious, and economic sense. And this becomes very difficult to do because we have found that most people in policy-making positions do not know enough about American history to begin to come to grips with us on a discussion of the issues. When Nixon was in the White House, a caravan called the Trail of Broken Treaties went into Washington, took over the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and presented 20 points to the administration. By and large, if you want to boil those 20 points down, it was simply a request that the United States government go back to a treaty-making relationship with the tribes and get away from all the bureaucracy, the rules and regulations. And the response of the White House assistant was that the United States couldn't make treaties with its own citizens, and therefore we would have to struggle along. The advice at that point from New York Times and Washington Post was that we shouldn't go around sacking federal buildings, and that the Indians should obey the law and go into the courts. Now that the people in Maine have obeyed the law and gone into the courts, are in danger of taking 80% of Maine, and the Washington Post and New York Times have got a new editorial saying Indians really shouldn't dig up old laws to harass the white men, that they should do something else. It's very difficult dealing with the Eastern media because they're always one logical step ahead of you in terms of the solution. They never really come to grips with anything. But they're always giving advice and giving editorials which always postpone the solution. But I think the essence of Indian affairs today is a demand by American Indians that non-Indian society recognize the national character of Indian tribes. And I think one of the most important things in this respect is the recognition by non-Indians that the Indians didn't go out to the United States and ask for treaties to be signed. For the most part, tribes were living in their homelands in the United States, appropriated money, appointed commissioners, sent these commissioners out to the Indian homelands and tried to negotiate massive sales of land. Our contention is if the United States wanted different terms in the treaties than what are in the treaties, that they had the opportunity at the time the treaties were negotiated to change those around. But having negotiated the treaties that now exist and having declared that they are the law of the land, I think all Indians are really asking is those treaties be enforced. And the argument that we generally get from the White House on down is that the treaties are old and therefore, through the passage of time, treaties become no good. We recognize that this attitude, if something is old, that it becomes invalid, was first applied to the Ten Commandments by the people in Congress. And I always tell the kids who used to protest that they got the message, make love, not war, across too well to Congress, because that's all they've been doing. Wayne Hayes and Wilbur Mills and others for the last 5 years. But what we're really dealing with is fighting this attitude that because something is old, therefore it has no legal force. It becomes very interesting if you go back even 30 years in this century. In 1958, the New York Power Authority wanted to condemn 4,400 acres of land on the Tuscarora Reservation. They filed a condemnation proceeding. The tribe went to court with them, and the tribe maintained that that the state of New York could not condemn Indian land without a formal treaty between the state of New York and the Indians. Now, the state of New York had to find some way to get out of this. What they did when it went on up in the appellate court and finally the Supreme Court is the United States resuscitated this law of 1790, which said that there must be a federal presence whenever an Indian tribe sells its land. The Supreme Court and the appellate court then implied that because the Federal Power Commission had issued a license to build a dam to the New York Power Authority, that thereby there was a federal presence at this condemnation, and therefore the condemnation was valid. Following that case, anyone who was relatively astute immediately recognized that this threw in jeopardy the land titles of the 13 original colonies, because there had been no federal presence for the most part in any of the land cessions of Indians in those areas. And in the mid-60s, I counseled with a number of people in New York. I discovered later one of them was an FBI man, but I talked with people about going into the East because the demand of the Eastern media was that they would not take us seriously until we did something in New York. I kept trying to point out to them that no Indian in his right mind would want to live in New York, much less own it. An old Potawatomi chief told me that New York was the best deal we ever made. But I counseled a number of Indians that they should really go after East Coast titles. We had, and still have, the deed to a large park in Philadelphia that William Penn set aside as an Indian reservation. But I've also counseled people that Rizzo is not the type of guy that respects the law to begin with, and that if you go in there and try and claim that park, the chances are that you're going to have a long run in Philadelphia if you get out alive at all. But this was percolating in a great many people's minds from the mid-60s on. So it was simply a matter of time until the right tribe of Indians got the right attorneys and began to do research and then simply moved it through. I think one of the side effects that you can see from this type of presentation is that all the Eastern liberal senators who once loved Indians are now pulling into their foxholes and hiding. We don't hear nearly as much about Indian rights from Teddy Kennedy anymore, now that part of Massachusetts has a suspect title. And Muskie, I think 10 years ago, was introducing bills in Congress that would have helped some of the Eastern tribes. We don't hear very much from Ed Muskie anymore. If we could work out a way to send George McGovern and James Aberest to the east to get them out of South Dakota, it might be an even trade to drop some of the lawsuits. But what I think we face at the present time is the liberal wing that used to support Indian causes is now running for the bushes. And it was perfectly all right with them to come out and harass Frank Church and other people in the West about how they treated Indians. Now that we've brought the Indian matter right to their front door, we see a startling reversal of the support and sympathy we once had. Through all of this, however, we are still unable to impress upon the non-Indian public that those treaties are a recognition, and a recognition in a fundamental international sense of the political status of American Indians. There are currently today at least two groups working on the international scene and attempting to educate foreign nations as much as possible so that the next time the peanut jumps on Russia for being mean to its Jews, that the Russians and Chinese will turn around and jump on the United States for being mean to its Indians. And at that point, we'll find out whether charity begins at home or whether it's a foreign affairs football that you kick around the world. I don't know how far we're going to get with the dependent domestic nation, but the recommendations that were released today that I drew up for the Field Foundation, and I suppose are fairly widely distributed at this point, come back, I think, to a very simple premise, and that is that whether you accept Indians as a self-governing, quasi-independent nation or not, the fundamental premise in American political thought is the consent of the governed. And no Indian tribe today has the power or is allowed to govern themselves in the same manner that any small town in Iowa would be allowed to govern themselves, or any state or municipality. Most Indian tribes are subject today to total control of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, I think throughout history, has been maybe one of the most detrimental things ever to happen to Indians. We used to like to refer to it as a hotbed of inertia, because they can go on and on and on forever and never seem to get anything done. I understand there was a hearing in January, what they call oversight legislative hearing, to see if there are any problems that remain to be solved. And the suggestion was made the Bureau of Indian Affairs cut 4,000 people off its rolls, 4,000 employees, so they could streamline their office. And the man giving testimony for the Bureau said in order to cut 4,000 people off our employment list, we'd have to hire another 400 to get the job done. You can see with an attitude like that that you're not going to get very far. Now, Don Wanatee explained the basis of this. He said that when Custer was going out to Montana, he stopped by the Bureau and said, "Don't do anything till I get back." Being good bureaucrats, they're taking orders and they're still waiting for Custer to return. But the major load on our back is the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and is a little phrase that is contained in almost all Indian legislation. No matter what you may read in the newspapers, no matter what you may see on television, or how hopeful things look, you can have 2- and 3-year congressional investigations of the problems of Indians. You can write the best law that was ever devised. If you look at the closing sections of Indian legislation, they generally read, there's generally a concluding section that says the Secretary of Interior is empowered to make such rules and regulations as he may deem necessary to fulfill this act, which in effect means everything that's come before is window dressing. What you're doing is turning over basically a legislative function to an administrative body. Then you get a situation where no matter what an Indian tribe wants to do, because the Secretary of Interior has discretionary power, he can interpret the law to his wishes and do what he wants. At the earliest stage of the civil rights movement, when the 3 workers were killed down in Mississippi, there was at the same time a big flack over opening a new school for the Choctaw Indians of Philadelphia, Mississippi, or integrating their school with the public schools. I sat in the Commissioner of Indian Affairs office, and he assigned one attorney to find the reasons why he was prohibited from opening the school. He assigned another attorney to go find the reasons why he was required by law to open the school. When he had both options, then he said, what I'm going to do is wait till the last minute. Whichever way the politics falls, I will have a position paper ready to do it. If you vest that kind of authority in any administrative body, then you've in effect vested all 3 functions of government in it. Our solution to get away from that type of operation is then to put it straight to the United States, that if you look back in American history, you have almost total independence of Indian tribes from the United States up until the point the last treaties are signed. At that point, because the United States must deliver annuities and must provide certain services under the treaty, you begin the transformation of not simply providing services and performing functions, but Bureau of Indian Affairs people stepping in and making decisions on behalf of Indian tribes. Our proposal is to go back to 1871, pick up where we left off, and begin to negotiate agreements with the United States. The nature of these agreements would be that each individual tribe would be able to sit down with federal negotiators and work out a package for 50 or 100 years, what they wanted to happen with respect to their lands and people. And that when this package was satisfactorily put together, it would be sent out to the people of the different tribes, and depending on the tribe that had designed the package, then they would have 2 years to hold 2 consecutive referendums to have the people approve that package. Upon the people's approval, then it would be sent to Congress, and Congress would pass it. It would become the federal law governing that reservation. This would, over the course of time, as you negotiated different treaties with different tribes, wipe out all of existing federal law and substitute individual treaties for it. And I think there's an excellent reason why that should be done. I was up with the Quinault Indians about 3 years ago, January, and we were investigating some of the scandal that's occurred on their timberlands. And in the evening, after working the Federal Archives there in Seattle all day, Helen Mitchell, who was one of the leaders of the Complaining Indian Party, she and myself and another scholar were having dinner, and the local agent of the BIA came in. And he was terribly distressed because he had a problem on the Snohomish Port Gamble Reservation. There was a piece of land of 12 acres, and a white man owned 1/6 of it, and an Indian owned 5/6 of it. The solution of the bureaucrat was that he should make the Indian sell his 10 acres to the white man, rather than partitioning the land or asking the white man to sell his 2 acres to the Indian. And I said, well, this seems to be a very simple thing to solve. You take a surveyor's instrument, you go out and you lop off 2 acres, I don't care which way it is, and you simply issue title for that and keep the other 10 acres in trust. And he said, well, we don't have anything in the rules and regulations that allows us to do that. Now, this was pretty shocking to me because allotments have been very common in Indian country since 1830s. And I couldn't believe you could get to 1974 without that problem ever coming up. So I quizzed him a little more, and he said, well, sure, that problem's come up with a lot of reservations, but he said, it's never come up with this reservation. And rather than take a chance that I might be wrong, he said, what I've asked for is a solicitor's opinion to tell me what I should do. That, of course, will take 6 months. Then I have to get the approval of the commissioner and the area director. And finally, he said, I know it'll come down. The Indian will have to sell his land to the white man. And I said, that's going to be terrible that that's going to take so long, because when Dennis Banks and Russell Means find out about it, they're going to come in here with 300 Indians with rifles, and you're going to have all kinds of problems. And he said, well, how would they find that out? And I said, well, I'm going to tell them as soon as I get back. Well, let me tell you, it didn't take 10 days, but what that agent was able to solve that land problem. The white man gladly sold his 2 acres to the Indian, and there were no more difficulties. You see, once those people get a discretionary hold and the chance to quibble, then you're tied up with endless waiting and nonsense. We traced on the Quinault Reservation that in order to sell a piece of timberland, the Indian had to have the signatures of 19 different bureaucrats. The last 11 signatures were people in Washington, D.C., who 9 times out of 10 didn't even know Washington was a state yet, let alone it was in the Union. And we're trying to, when we propose in a new treaty-making mechanism, what we're saying is that no tribe should have to deal with bureaucrats like that. The bureaucrats should not have those excuses available to them to hamper the Indians in what they want to do. When I lived in Washington for 2 years, I lived about 3 miles from the Lummi Reservation. And I ended up writing about a 200-page paper for the Smithsonian on these people. It was absolutely incredible. For over 100 years, the Bureau of Indian Affairs kept coming up with economic development projects for the Lummi. The last one was to create the Lummi Weavers, and that was to have a whole bunch of Indian women in a very drafty building making knitted ties. And this was supposed to be a great economic development project for a tribe of 1,600 people. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, after the Lummi Weavers failed, threw up their hands and they said, we don't want anything more to do with the Lummi Indians. That these people are a disaster. They've never been able to take orders. They never understood what we were trying to do. We'll have no more to do with them. As soon as the Indians found out they weren't going to see the Bureau anymore, they went to EDA and got about a $3 million loan. They took a freshwater bay and created an aquaculture, which is the finest aquaculture on the West Coast. They now produce something like 20 million, I guess it's 2 million pounds of oyster seed. They can outproduce the Japanese. They can undercut Japanese producers in oyster seed. They produce millions of pounds of salmon and trout and clams and oysters. It took the Bureau of Indian Affairs almost 3 years after they'd abandoned the Lummis to discover what the Lummis were doing. One day a Bureau guy comes up and here's this gigantic dike, and the Indians have already got their own logo. They're already marketing their fish in San Francisco. They're talking about flying it to Japan and New York City. The Bureau of Indian Affairs finally discovers what should be done. EDA, in the meantime, is walking all over the country with their chest popping because they're able to help one tribe get away from the Bureau. And Indians go in and talk to the Undersecretary of Interior, and they say, we'd like additional money to expand this, and we'd like to help, we'd like to use our process of aquaculture with a number of tribes who have freshwater lakes and rivers. The Interior Department was furious, and they said, you people got away from us, but we'll never ever let another Indian tribe get away from us. And that was their attitude toward Indian economic development. But in what we're proposing at the present time, you cut all of that off right at the ankles, that you would no longer deal with those type of bureaucrats, that your negotiations would be, at least at the White House level, drawing up a proposed solution for your people and then putting this into Congress as a special act. Now, we've been unable up to the present time to raise this alternative with the policymakers in Washington. They've taken the attitude, as I said before, that when we're protesting, then we should work through the law. When we work through the law, then we shouldn't bring up legal rights, because that's very embarrassing. Exactly what they want, I don't know. But they force us at the present time to go into courts. And I'm very hesitant to do this, primarily for the sake of the people in office in the United States. Because there's so many aspects of Indian rights that today are very easy to prove in court. And we have talked over and over again with numerous people around the country that we don't really want to go into court because we can beat you. We say, if you want to go through a 5-year court battle, end up losing and get everything polarized, all kinds of bad feelings, and everybody running around frantic, then we'll go ahead and do it. But there must be another solution to things. Several years ago, the Puyallup Indians, which now there are probably about 400 of them, they live in very small little settlements along the riverbanks of Washington. They kept having the Washington State Fish and Game and the Washington State Troopers harass them because they were fishing. They took a lawsuit to show that they had jurisdiction over the tiny little areas that they lived in. And one of the theories they used is a theory articulated by the Supreme Court a number of times, to the effect that until Congress extinguishes the exterior boundaries of a reservation, an Indian tribe has jurisdiction over what happens there, total jurisdiction under the federal setup. Now, what the state of Washington didn't know, they didn't know a heck of a lot about the history of the Puyallups or the subdivision of the state of Washington. They insisted on going in with it. They end up with the Indians winning and the judge saying you have civil and criminal jurisdiction over the lands within the boundary of the original Puyallup Reservation. That land is today called Tacoma, Washington. You have 400 Indians with civil and criminal powers over 400,000 whites. Now that's a situation that we have been warning state and federal officials about over and over again. That you simply can't say to Indians, okay, go on into court and prove it, because we can prove it. We can take most of South Dakota, most of Nevada, and most of the East. What you end up with are now, and I think that we'll be dealing with in the next 2 or 3 years, are lawsuits that have gone halfway through and have gotten to the point where the evidence clearly shows the Indians are going to win. All of a sudden, you're going to have a traumatized peanut and all kinds of people running around saying, well, the Indians take 20 billion or 30 billion, or how do we get out of this mess? And so what I've offered in this Phil Foundation pamphlet, and I think what a lot of Indian tribes, and particularly traditional people, have been offering for the last 4 or 5 years, is this alternative to the United States. That if you can once break through the ring of administrative assistants and talk to policymakers, and spend enough time with them and lay out the conditions under which land was taken, the conditions under which treaties were signed, and the definition of statutes, that it should be very easy for those people to understand that under the present setup of law, we can fight for the next 30 years and wreak tremendous havoc in the United States insofar as land titles are concerned. But it's too much trouble for us to go through, and it should be too much trouble for states and cities and the federal government to go through. And there must certainly be an easier solution. As I say, if we can break through the ring of administrative assistants who know virtually nothing about American history or federal Indian law, and get to the policymakers and say, now this is what we propose. The people sit down today and talk over what are the problems, what are the rights, and what is the solution. Unless you can do that, you end up inevitably in court, and as I said, in court we can win. It's free right of passage through their lands. The United States said, after the war is over, we'll come back and sign a treaty and we'll set aside reservations and make this thing official. The United States never did come back over the Western Shoshones and sign a treaty, so that Treaty of Ruby Valley, 1863, kind of hangs there as a historical warning. But over the years, the United States finally got some Shoshones who were willing to allow their names to be used. An attorney filed in the Indian Claims Commission. They're trying to rush this gigantic suit through before any of the people out in the Battle Mountain area discovered what was going on. Part of the suit maintained that the United States had legally taken the Indian lands as of 1871. And the way they picked this date, the attorney who was supposed to be working for the Indians and the attorney who was supposed to be working for the United States government got together one afternoon. They said 1871's a nice date. Let's stipulate that the United States took the land then. And so they went into court and said this is when the United States took the land. But they brought this almost to the point where they could award the money for the land, declare that it had officially been taken in 1871, and distribute the money and just bury this case. The traditional Shoshones discovered this. A filmmaker friend of mine, Joel Friedman, put it on film. I think some of you saw it in the Treaty of Battle Mountain. What happened as part of the activities after that film was shot was that the Indian Claims Commission looked like it was going to shove this case right on through without anybody getting a chance to talk about it. So 2 women took their cattle and they grazed their cattle on land controlled by the Bureau of Land Management with the hopes that the government would sue the women for criminal trespass, and thereby the women could respond in their defense that they were grazing the cattle on their own land and they could get by the sovereign immunity of the United States. You can't go right into court and sue the United States. But if the United States sues you, you can certainly defend by bringing up your whole case. So they grazed their cattle on public domain land for about a month. Sure enough, the U.S. attorneys took the bait, and they came rushing in. They said, "Get your cattle off this land or we'll sue you." And the Indians smiled and they said, "Okay, sue us." So they sued them, and right away there's a big lawsuit in saying we cannot possibly be criminally trespassing because we own this land under the Treaty of Ruby Valley. So the judge got together with the Indian attorney and the U.S. attorney, and they worked out an arrangement where, at least the first go-round of this case, the issue would be the issues of law and not the issues of fact. And I went over in September '75 to listen to the case, and the U.S. attorney that they'd flown out from Washington, D.C. was allegedly an expert in the land rights and history of the Western Shoshone, the Washoe, and the Paiute. He was introduced with big fanfare in the federal court as the leading expert and the leading attorney concerning the history and legal rights of these three tribes. Well, we had close to 400 Indians go to the federal courthouse in Reno. And of course, the first thing that you see when you walk in the door are two very nervous federal marshals, because they've never seen this many Indians together in their lives. So you didn't dare go for your cigarettes for fear that a federal marshal would shoot you. And nobody wanted to smile because they were so scared that you didn't want to spook them so that there'd be an incident. So everybody just very casually filed in the courtroom, sat just about like you're sitting now. And nobody wanted to look to one side or another because these marshals are walking around just like Marshal Dillon, up and down the aisles trying. It's a very serious situation. And U.S. Attorney starts making his arguments. Well, he has the history of Nevada wrong. He has dates out of sequence. He's citing laws that are favorable to the Indians. After 10 minutes, the Indians are starting to giggle, and the judge is kind of like this, and the U.S. Attorney realizes he's losing the case. So he draws himself up in a big flourish, and he says, Your Honor, we're not even sure these two defendants are Indians. And the judge almost fell off his chair, and he said, well, look at them. They certainly appear to be Indians. And they were very good-looking, middle-aged Indian cattlewomen. And wore some Indian clothes, but mostly what cattlewomen out in Nevada, Utah wear, the denims and boots, the whole costume. And the judge looked at him, he said, well, we've been working on this case 9 months, and I'm sure that these are Indians. And he said, what would ever give you any cause to think they're not Indians? And the U.S. Attorney said, well, look at them. He said, they could be Sicilians or Basques or... And Judge says, well, I think we're kind of wasting our time. If these aren't Indians, then what are we doing here in this court? And he said, I would like some positive proof that these are not Indians before I rule on this question. And he said, well, do you have any other reason to believe they're not Indians? And the U.S. Attorney says, well, all we have is their affidavit saying they're Indians. Well, by this time I started to get very nervous because the Indians are all giggling in the courtroom. The U.S. Marshals are really uptight, and they don't know whether to start shooting people to maintain order or what. So the judge says, well, why don't you sum up your case? And the attorney draws himself up a little tighter, and he said, well, the United States now formally charges the Western Shoshones with abandoning their lands. He says, Your Honor, we can't find any Indians in Nevada who would claim these lands. Well, by this time, the courtroom had just busted out, totally laughing. The judge, of course, the attorney's got his back, the Indians. The judge looks out and he says, well, I think if you turn around, you'll find plenty of Indians who claim this land. And he finally looks at the attorney and he says, I think you better sit down. I think you've kind of overstated your case. But when the U.S. attorney seriously told the judge he couldn't find any Indians in Nevada who'd be willing to lay claim to that land, even the U.S. Marshals relaxed because it was such a demeaning situation. Well, I mention that half in jest and half in great sympathy for the United States. But, when you're up against attorneys like that, you have an extremely difficult time from the Indian point of view of presenting a sensible statement of the case. Because if your opponents know absolutely nothing about federal Indian law or Indian history or the history of the West, then how in the world can you discuss the complicated issues of 100 years ago with regard to land title, occupancy, civil and criminal jurisdiction, hunting and fishing, all the things that go into a treaty rights case? It isn't simply a case of fighting ignorant opponents that you can easily overcome. What you end up is totally at sea at trying to present the materials because the people, 9 times out of 10, the judge knows even less than the two attorneys who've been working on the case, and what you end up with the United States presenting so little of a case that there's no way the judge can really make any decision with respect to it. I worked with the people in the Wounded Knee case, and we were taking the treaty issue up, and I went up to Minneapolis to argue the circuit. The U.S. attorney starts out and he says, well, I don't know if we have jurisdiction over these Indians or not, but certainly, he said, we must have acquired jurisdiction at some time because we exercise it, and I don't know whether DeSoto got it for us or Lewis and Clark or who, but he said, I really don't think that's the issue. The point is that we exercise jurisdiction over them now. We intend to continue exercising it, so I don't see why they should have to come to court and question our right to do this. Now, you're starting kind of a little bit behind the starting line when you have to respond to something like that. And I pointed out that if the U.S. didn't know whether it had jurisdiction, it didn't know when it acquired it, it didn't know the extent of it, it didn't know how to use it, that could it, in fact, legally be said that the United States had jurisdiction at all. That was too complicated for a three-court panel of judges, and we end up in the Supreme Court, and I think the whole thing at that point was totally beyond them. I kind of wished at that point that Gordon Hruska had got a few mediocre minds on the court, so that we could have had someone we could communicate very simple issues like 1819 comes before 1875, 1884 comes before 1889, and the reason we number our years is we want them in some kind of sequence, and all you have to do is follow the sequence and you're going to be all right. But that's not nearly as bad as what happened to me right here in your own state, Cedar Rapids, last July. Bill Kunstler just finished cross-examining me in the FBI trial, and the U.S. attorney came up and went in this long, incredible explanation. He didn't want to insult me. He didn't know what to call me. He knew I was a Sioux Indian, but he didn't want to call me a Native American unless I really appreciated the name, and he didn't know whether to call me an Aborigine or an Amarin. After 8 minutes of this apology, he finally said, well, I realize that the only reason you're called American Indians is because Columbus was looking for India. And I said, yeah, we're all glad he wasn't looking for Turkey. That kind of brought that phase of cross-examination to a close, and we got into other things. But it completely baffles you that you're able to meet with hundreds of people, federal policymakers, over the course of a year, and never ever once be able to sit down long enough with these people, or communicate enough with these people so they can see the very simplest of things. I've got a good friend on the Indian Claims Commission, John Vance. He's an attorney from Montana, and every time I come up with a new way of presenting this basic idea that Indians really are small nations, and if you just go with that and let them govern themselves and protect their land base, you're not going to have the problems you have. I come up with these ideas, I call John up and I float the idea with him, and he listens for 10 minutes, and then he says, they'll never buy it, it's too simple. And I laughed at him the first couple times. And now, after 5 or 6 years of proposing things, I realize that John's right all the time. If you offer people in the political institutions a simple solution to things, they get terribly traumatized, and they have to appoint a task force to figure out how to make it complicated. And they say, we're going to have to study this thing to see what you're really talking about. Well, if you're able to present it in plain English in 7 pages, and it then takes them 6 months, and they return a 40-page memo to you which says virtually nothing. This goes on endlessly for year after year after year, and you finally become astounded at the fact that we've put idiots in charge of this government. Either they don't know how to read, they don't know how to think, or they don't know how to do both. They certainly don't know how to respond to very simple questions and answer procedures. I'll tell you a very funny thing that happened to me with that respect. After Wounded Knee closed, the White House sent people out to Pine Ridge. They sat down and talked with the traditional chiefs. Then they went back to Washington. They said they were going to issue a report, and they never issued a report. So the meeting was in June, and long about September, the traditional chiefs got very uptight, and they said, we're getting the runaround from Nixon's people. And of course, Nixon was fighting for his life in the Watergate thing at that time, and nobody wanted to deal with Indians. So one of the traditional chiefs called me up, and they said, what can we do to bring this negotiation along a little further? I said, let me write up a bill of particulars, which will simply examine all legal points contained in the treaty. Then whichever ones we can get the government to agree are solved or should be discussed, we can eliminate an awful lot of confusion. And I said we can pinpoint what has to be discussed from now on, and instead of all these memos back and forth. So I drew up this bill of particulars. I think it was about 20 pages long, and we sent it into the White House. They said they'd need time to respond to this. They waited till the morning of the day that the Means Banks trial opened up in Minneapolis. And the judge didn't want any discussion of the '68 treaty while the trial was going on. So the White House ended up with all the publicity by issuing their report saying the '68 treaty was good, and we're virtually gagged until the Means Banks trial was over for us to respond publicly to the White House saying that the treaty was good. So we all forgot we just dropped it until the Means Banks trial was over. Now, about 2 years later, when Senator Abrest's American Indian Policy Review Commission started operating, they had new people come in. They were going to investigate what had happened from Wounded Knee on and all the twists and turns. They called over to the White House and they said they wanted a paper of my response to the White House paper that responded to my original questions. Now, I want you to understand, I had never written this response because the Means Banks trial was on. The White House told them that their only copy of my response was sealed under court order in the Nixon papers, and they would have to get a subpoena to get a copy of that, and why didn't they just call me and get my copy of it? I suddenly discovered the Ford White House was covering up a document that didn't exist. And so Senator Abrest's commission calls me and they said, we want a copy of your response to the White House. And I said, I never wrote up a response because I didn't want the judge to feel we were trying to influence the Means Banks trial by issuing all these press releases on my response to the White House. And he said, well, that's really funny because everybody in the White House insists they can't give us their copy because it's under orders from Sirica not to give Nixon's private papers away. So what I thought I'd do is wait about 20 years and then type up my response and float it through several agencies where they'll notice the date, and I'll predate it or post-date it, and I'll let them, all those people, file my response 20 years later. And about every 2 years thereafter, I will write different types of responses and keep dating them and send them to different agencies. And I'll introduce a situation of cover-up in the federal establishment because there'll all be different reports, they'll all have different dates, they'll all be about the times the Means Banks trial had opened. And since the federal government has a propensity to cover up, no one's going to admit that they have a copy of this particular response. I think in the course of the history, just that one thing, I can change what happens in the United States over the next 100 years. Because it would kind of like the Howard Hughes wills. But that's the situation we face today. We get instances where the people know so little about the negotiations going on, they cover up documents that don't exist. They talk about meetings that were never held. They talk about resolutions they don't know who passed, they don't know why. And again, our simple response, which I think has been the response for the last 5 years, is let us just talk to whoever is running the show. Let us sit down for 2 or 3 days and simply go over what's happened and explain to you how you can short-circuit all of the red tape, how you can get rid of all of the nonsense, and how you can recognize finally the legal rights of Indian tribes and their political existence as dependent domestic nations, which is what the treaties say, which is what the Constitution says. It says Congress regulate commerce among the several states and with the Indian tribes. And there's separate political category in the Constitution. All the Supreme Court, all the major Supreme Court decisions say Indians are dependent domestic nations. And so the solution to Indian affairs, in my opinion, is a very simple solution. But the point is that there's no one in Washington who either wants to listen to it or is intelligent enough to understand what we're saying. And I think you can see that would be true with Congress because Don Wanity told me the only sane member of Congress to be certified sane by competent medical authorities is Eagleton. Now, and the rest of them have not been checked out, probably need to be. But now at the beginning of the new administration, with the Peanut and PepsiCo or Coca-Cola back in the saddle, and Pepsi-Cola and Nixon out of the saddle, I'm looking, I hope, at a whole new ballgame. But as I said, I would feel much more comfortable if he lusted after Indians rather than just acknowledged our existence. I'd like to close now, since this was kind of a complicated thing, and take questions, because I'm much more incisive, I think, with questions than with simple speeches. So thank you very much. I'd like to take questions at this time.
Is there any indication of how receptive the current administration will be to changing policies toward Indian Americans?
No, the only indication we have now is a fairly negative one. About 2 months ago, a number of us passed the word through to the White House that we'd like to simply come in and sit down on an informal basis, that we did not claim to represent anybody, that all we would represent would be the cumulative experience of our time working the field of Indian affairs. We thought we were getting fairly good reception until we're just about to decide on an informal date when we could meet with some of those people, and they insisted on pulling a man from Interior into the meeting. And we said, we can always see people from Interior. Generally, they've been very unresponsive, and they're basically very stupid people in Interior. And it's always the cousin of the senator who couldn't get a job anyplace else. And they don't want him in agriculture, and they don't want him in commerce. They put him in Interior. And then he changes from Schedule C over to regular civil service, and you're stuck with him for the rest of your life. And so they said that they would not hold a meeting with us unless somebody from Interior was there. And we said, well, Interior's the problem. If we really don't want to meet with Interior, if the White House insists that we have to meet with Interior people, we don't want to do it. So I haven't been home in about 5 days. I don't know where those negotiations are. We were trying to pull those back together and say, let us just come sit down with you sometime within the month and discuss what we think can be done. But I think the Carter administration is like the past administrations. They get in there and they're burning with reform for 2 months. Then suddenly they get the idea that if they say anything about federal wrongdoing, everyone's going to blame them. So they start to cover everything up as fast as they can. I saw the Nixon people do it. I was ready to blow the whistle on all the Democrats. And at the start, the Nixon people were perfectly happy to blow the whistle on the Democrats. After 2 months, they started saying, well, if we say there's anything wrong, we're going to get blamed. And I said, I can take you clear back to the early 60s where the Democrats were doing bad things, and they didn't want to do it. No, we don't want to blow the whistle on anybody. So I think that's what happens almost immediately when you get a new administration. That they're burning with reform for a couple months. They suddenly realize then that they are actually in office. And from then on, they freak out, and you just forget it. So I don't think this administration's got off on a very good foot. But it takes peanut farmers a while to get going. It's a slow crop. I don't know. I don't hold a very high opinion of McGovern. I've not followed his career of late. I was kind of disappointed that he was so outraged at the killing of Vietnamese, but he wasn't outraged when they were killing Indians in his own state. So I don't think very much of the guy. In addition, he and Abreast didn't put together a very good basketball team to represent South Dakota anyway. So you can't get a good basketball team. God knows that you can't do any more complicated things. I don't see any right now. Now, Lloyd Meads was allegedly a good friend of Indians till he had a close election. And he was put in with absentee ballots that were counted about 3 weeks after the election. All of a sudden, he freaked and went 180 degrees and hired somebody to write this incredible anti-sovereignty dissent that he filed with the Abreast Commission. As I said, the Eastern liberals, it was very easy for them to be friends of Indians because all the Indians were 2,000 miles away. See, now if they come in waving colonial deeds, you know, it's a different story.
In Carter's notebook of promises, what is contained that relates to the Indians?
He didn't promise Indians anything, no. So we don't have broken hearts at all. It's, I.W. Abel and those guys, are Ralph Nader, crying in their beer, but he didn't promise us a damn thing.
Who's the Field Foundation that you referred to, and what's your relationship to them?
Yeah.
Another question. Is there any national organization that you work through? You mentioned you go from coast to coast and border to border. Is that all on your own, or is there a single organization that you work through in those efforts?
No, well, let me answer your first question first. The Field Foundation is one of the most progressive private foundations in the country. It was involved with, I think, the most creative aspect of the civil rights movement about 10 years ago, and sponsored the Board of Inquiry into Hunger and Malnutrition in the United States. It must have been 8 or 10 years ago. And beginning last summer, and I'm not sure the figures here, I think contacted about 12 people around the country to write special pamphlets outlining major fields in which reform could be accomplished, with the idea that single thinkers can often synthesize problems and solutions much easier than task force commissions. As soon as it became apparent with Carter with a 30-point lead last July and August, a lot of people started talking, well, we ought to have a commission of inquiry into this, that, or the other thing. And I think Field was approached by some of those people wanting to set up poverty commissions and malnutrition commissions, other things. And they opted instead to find 10 or 12 people who would write a major analysis of certain problem areas. And then the foundation would make that public and make copies available to whoever they wanted, with the idea that certain thinkers would be given a chance to simply make a statement. So that's my relationship with them. I don't work with any particular organization at the present time. I have all the things on my, I never keep my Vita up to date. So frequently speakers introduce me as working with all these groups, and I've usually long since left those groups. I do pay my dues to Amnesty International just in case. You never know what's going to happen. Other than that, I don't, I belong to the professional, American Bar Association, Authors Guild, those things. But I've pretty much given up on national social movement organizations. And it started becoming very apparent to me about 5 or 6 years ago that you couldn't have a revolution if everybody had to collect per diem all the time and stay at the Holiday Inn. And so I kind of drifted out of all that power movement and stuff, because I never heard of holding a revolution where you had to issue consultant fees all the time. So I've kind of abandoned all that stuff now. Coming together in the 51st state? Well, it's a subject that kind of comes and goes. Sometimes it's very popular, other times I think the phenomenon you see is a lot of tribes, I guess you call them medium-sized tribes, maybe the enrollment from 5 to 10,000, will start thinking we ought to do this. Then when the talk starts to get very serious and they discover if they did that, the Navajos would hold the voting strength over the other tribes, and they'd kind of back off. There are two treaties, the Delaware Treaty and the Cherokee Treaty, which say that they can send delegates to Congress. But we never had Indian crazy enough to send to that place, so. So nobody's wanted to do that. But it kind of comes and goes. It's very difficult to figure how people want to look at that. And you see, if we could get western South Dakota and establish that as a Sioux nation, we'd be the third leading nuclear power in the world. get all those silos, and then we'd really get to work. Other than that, it's kind of a sporadic thing. That it's offered as an alternative a lot. I don't think people discuss it very seriously.
Is the Canadian bureaucratic structure any more efficient in dealing with their Indian matters?
I used to think so, but I hear reports that they're really not. But the BIA is hopeless. I mean, just forget it. To tell about these things? Yeah, there are two major newspapers printed that would give you a lot of in-depth information in this. One's Akwesasne Notes out of the Mohawk Nation in New York, and the other's Wasaha from the West Coast. I think they do, my favorite, I mean, I'm much more inclined toward Akwesasne Notes. It's kind of an Indian commune up there. They don't charge subscriptions. They just say donate whatever you can when you can. And they've done considerable in-depth analysis of certain things. I think they're a very good group. You had White Roots of Peace here, what, this week? When? Oh, the Iowa City. Somebody doesn't like Indians to schedule us in Iowa City out there. Huh? They were here a couple of years ago. Yeah, they're the guys who put out Akwesasne Notes. It's a good newspaper. Well, I think it was a good movement, but what people don't understand, it really was a movement. And I mean, it was never an organization. And I used to have a black FBI guy that would follow me in Wisconsin, and he'd sit in the audience, like you people, and he'd always say, "How does AIM get its money?" And I'd say, you know, I don't know how AIM gets their money. You know, I'd speak in Milwaukee, and I'd be up at Eau Claire, and he's the same guy, different suit, you know. How does AIM get its money? I said, I don't know. And I still don't know how, you know. I know they sponge a lot of drinks off me when I see them, but how they pay some of the other expenses, I don't know.
What, if anything, do you think will be the fate of the Indian Policy Review Commission?
Well, I hope Carter pardons the people who worked on that. I'd hate to see him serve jail time for being employed by the U.S. Senate. For those of you who don't know, right after Wounded Knee, Senator Abress from South Dakota set up what's known as the American Indian Policy Review Commission. And this was to hold a 2-year investigation of Indian affairs and come up with solutions. We used to characterize it as 39 experts looking for a storyline, see, because they ran all over the country. They didn't know what they were looking at. They didn't know what they should come up with. They ended up with a lot of sociologists from the University of Maryland writing their final report. And in my opinion, they didn't get anywhere near any of the problems. The whole idea we wanted with a Congressional Policy Review Commission was to actually get senators and congressmen to come to Indian reservations and see how people lived. They eliminated that by setting up task forces, and they sent Indians around to talk to other Indians. Only one field hearing was any congressional member present. Now, Jim Abress flew into Denver to spend 2 hours with the commission at one point before he went to Albuquerque to raise money at a fundraising dinner. And that was the extent to which the congressional members on that commission actually looked at Indian problems. So I think it was a nice 2-year escapade for those who were favored and given employment on it. But they didn't come to any conclusions that the Peace Commission of 1868 didn't come to before them and put it in much simpler language. So it was exercise in futility, but what can you expect out of Washington, D.C.? 5 years from now, people are going to ask what it was, and nobody's going to know. Nobody knew when they were appointed, and